What's up, you guys? Void here, coming back at y'all with part 3 to 10 reasonable reprints for the Commander format this year, 2018. 10 cards that I feel that Wizards of the Coast should be well within their capabilities to reprint these cards either in Masters 25 or Commander 2018 or a Masters set maybe later this year. Who knows? So we're going to start it off with the first card, which is Reflecting Pool. It has been printed a few times. The last printing was Conspiracy in 2013. Also was reprinted in Shadowmoor, but was originally from Tempest. The card is around $10, so it is a bit more expensive than what I'm used to seeing for a lot of lands like these. If we use the example of Exotic Orchard, it has been reprinted a few times in recent history, so the fact that that has gone down a bit shows that even though the card is extremely playable in the format, $10 is just way too expensive for what it actually should be. I would say they're both on the same level as far as mana fixing goes. Obviously, Reflecting Pool is a little bit better because it works for your mana, but then again, there is a lot of options that you can get off of your opponent's lands, so it's hard to really defend Reflecting Pool being a $10 card, when if they just reprinted it in one of these Commander sets, it would definitely have been a lot lower than $10, so I think it should definitely get a reprint in Commander 2018 for sure, reprinted in every single Commander deck, whether it's 4 or 5. The next card is Nykthos Shrine to Nyx from Theros. Has never been reprinted, like a lot of cards from Theros, which is one of the reasons why it's a pretty underrated set, but you have a lot of good Commander cards like this. It's perfect. It's an auto-include for just about every single monocolored deck out there. All you have to do is basically just pay 2 mana and tap it, and you get to add mana to your mana pool equal to your devotion, so the number of mana symbols and the converted mana cost of cards that are on your board, which is kind of like a Cabal Coffers when you think about the potential to add mana in a lot of decks. Now, the card is around $8, which a card doesn't have to be super expensive to be on this list. It just has to be necessary in a lot of decks and not as available as people would like to think. And Nykthos is actually a little bit harder to get a hold of, and not as many people put that much of an emphasis on their mana base, especially when they go to monocolored decks. Usually it's just, well, let me just play for the most part basic lands. I don't need all the mana fixing in the world like every other deck does. I see it all the time. Some people don't play it, but it's definitely a good card. It should be reprinted in a Commander deck. And the next card we have is Batterskull. Only really been printed in New Phyrexia. Was printed as a Grand Prix promo, but that isn't going to affect the price too much. It's around $15, but it could easily be reprinted and be one of the chase cards when it comes to selling Commander precons, because it's not in that dangerous range like a lot of the swords are, where they're super duper expensive. They're like $30 and above. Batterskull is under $20, and we've seen a lot of cards that have been under $20 get reprints in Commander decks. Like we've seen $15 for cards like Mirari's Wake get reprinted in the Cat deck for Commander 2017. So don't tell me that a card like this couldn't just as easily get reprinted for Commander 2018. I could also see it as an easy inclusion to Masters 25. I don't know if it's going to be necessarily a card that represents 25 years of Magic, but I think it's a good inclusion if you talk about on the lower end of rares. Its price would go down compared to a lot of the better rares that they could put in the set, but I think it would be a good inclusion nevertheless. And then this next card is pretty much just for Commander, and that is Mirror Gallery. There are a ton of combos associated with this card, and it's really just janky, I know, but the card is so unique. It's only been printed in Betrayers of Kamigawa, but it's still a $13 card. It hasn't been reprinted whatsoever because it's such a weird out there card. I could understand the difficulties in finding a spot for it, but it's just so meant for Commander that it's a little bit of a surprise it hasn't been reprinted yet. The legend rule just doesn't apply. So if you have any commanders that combo with themselves being on the board, this is definitely a card for you. It's not a common card. It's not a common inclusion in Commander decks. It's not a staple, but this is what I would say is a card that is fun enough to consider. Even if it does have combo potential, a lot of the combos aren't the easiest in the world to pull off. So it's not in that dangerous area where if you reprint this card in a precon, it's just going to break the whole deck. But if there is a fun interaction with the Commander itself, I think it would be worth it. I don't know, maybe they could experiment with other cards, fooling around with the legend rule, but I think it's pretty cool. Then we have Greater Auramancy from Shadowmoor. There are a ton of cards from Shadowmoor that need reprinting, but this one is just perfect for enchantment decks. Any type of deck where you like auras, those creatures gain Shroud, and other enchantments you control gain Shroud. So it's a perfect card for any enchantment heavy decks. even if you don't really have a strategy with auras, but even if you do, it's even better. It sees a ton of play in Commander, decks like Rule the Miststalker, Sigarda Host of Herons, the Black-White Daxos from Commander 2015, Zur the Enchanter. It's a great card, but the price tag is still around $28 to $30, which is just way too expensive. It's never been reprinted. A lot of cards too are going to demand reprints because they've never been reprinted before, not just because they're super expensive. We could talk about super expensive cards that have been reprinted all the time, like Tarmogoyf. Those cards are just super playable in the formats they belong to. Commander's a little bit different. I mean, a lot of cards aren't going to be super expensive just because it's Commander, but rather because the cards haven't been reprinted at all. And Greater Auramancy is a perfect example of that. It's super cheap as far as mana cost goes, so I can understand why it's incredibly playable in a lot of decks. And it's really powerful. I mean, giving enchantments and enchanted creatures Shroud is fantastic. And then the next card we have is Phyrexian Metamorph. Now again, the card doesn't have to be super expensive. It doesn't have to be $20 and up in order to warrant a reprint. It just has to be uncommon enough, in my opinion, as far as reprints go. The card hasn't been reprinted really at all. It only has another promo version, but that was the launch party pre-release promo that's worth a couple dollars more. So the card hasn't been reprinted. It's in a range as far as the price goes that I think is healthy to just throw it into a good Commander deck pre-con, and I think it would work out brilliantly. Doesn't even have to be anything associated with artifacts, but just a good blue deck in general, or any deck playing blue I think would love a Phyrexian Metamorph in the pre-con. But this is yet another card that's a good staple that hasn't been reprinted at all. So like Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, like Batterskull, and like a lot of other cards in the format, it doesn't have to be super expensive in order to warrant a reprint. It just has to be a staple to the point where including it in a pre-con when it hasn't been reprinted before would be such a good idea, and I think it is. And then we have Mikaeus the Unhallowed from Dark Ascension, only been printed that one time. And yes, it is known for its combo potential in the format, but there are so many decks that just ignore the combos, such as zombies. And if they wanted to go with Zombie Tribal, they could definitely do that for Commander 2018. The card is about $28, super expensive, but again, that's because it's only been printed that one time. It doesn't really see any modern play as far as I'm concerned. I don't think it sees any. So it really just belongs to the Commander format as far as just seeing continuous play. You see him in Marchesa the Black Rose, you see him in Gave Guru of Spores, you see him in other zombie decks. There's just a lot of potential, whether it's graveyard synergies, whether it's +1/+1 counter synergies, whether it's the combos with Persist. He just sees a ton of play, and it's probably going to be something I would look to see in Masters 25, as opposed to them just throwing it into a Commander Precon. I think it would be much safer in 25, because again, it is in that dangerous zone where if you put it in a certain Commander deck, it could possibly break that deck, but still, nevertheless, it needs a reprint badly. And then the next two cards are going to be red cards. The first one we have to look at is Scourge of the Throne from Original Conspiracy. Now, the dethrone mechanic is pretty unique, but that's not the reason why it's so good. The reason why it's so good is because it can give you an extra combat phase. Now, if there's anything bad about it, it's the fact that you need to be able to trigger dethrone in order to get that extra combat phase, but it's still amazing in dragon decks. It's amazing in aggressive red decks that want to get extra combat phases. It's good in Marchesa the Black Rose, again, because it's dethrone. It gets a counter on itself. If it dies, it comes back in that deck. But the card is pretty expensive. It's around a $22 card because it's only been printed in Conspiracy, which isn't as common to come across. I think you're going to find that a lot of cards from these Conspiracy sets are going to be a little bit more expensive. The print run was a little bit smaller than what we're used to, so naturally a lot of cards from that set are going to be worth a bit more. I think it's a good idea for dragon decks. They could have reprinted it last year specifically for that dragon deck, but I wouldn't be surprised to see this as maybe one of the worst mythics that they could put in Masters 25. I think that would be an interesting idea. So then again, it might be an inclusion for a precon deck, so I think it's still worth it. Then we have Balefire Dragon, yet another dragon that hasn't been reprinted. from original Innistrad, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, it deals that much damage to each creature they control. So it's basically a good sweeper, your opponent's creatures, after it's done dealing combat damage. So I could see why they would be hesitant to throw this into a precon. If there's just not a lot of removal among the precon decks, it's going to be easy to deal that combat damage and then just dominate the game from that point. But the fact that this hasn't even been an easy inclusion, especially when you consider that Modern Masters was supposed to be the set that focused on Innistrad reprints. When we looked at Liliana of the Veil, when we looked at Snapcaster Mage, you would have thought that they would also consider a card like Balefire Dragon. Not necessarily modern playable, yeah, but it's still a card worthy of a reprint because it is sitting around $17. So sooner or later, you're going to have to reprint this card. A lot of good dragons have gotten reprints. We've seen Udvara Hellkite. We've seen Hellkite Tyrant got reprints in the last couple years. So a little bit of a surprise that they haven't hit Balefire Dragon yet, but I will still patiently wait. And then the last card we have to look at is Exploration. Now, unlike a lot of cards on this list, it has been reprinted in Conspiracy, which again, limited print run, not going to do too much, but was originally printed in Urza Saga, and it is holding its value at around $20 for the original Urza Saga and closer to $16 for the Conspiracy version. Both versions, I think, are a little bit too expensive, and I think this is the type of card that if you were to put it in a commander deck, it would provide that bit of ramp earlier on in the game, but it wouldn't break that deck. This is the one big misconception about this card. Yes, it is a one-drop enchantment, and you would think that getting it this early in the game would be that broken, but it doesn't give you more lands. It doesn't really do anything like that. It just speeds up your first few turns, and then once you run out of lands, you have to then top deck them, and then you run out of your extra land drops. So the card itself doesn't give you more lands, but it speeds up your first few turns. So that's really what it's here for. If you want to do something early, turn 1 or turn 2, well, you better hope that you draw into some lands to get more and more land drops. It's one of those weird cards that you would think it would be amazing and broken in a commander deck if you just throw it in there, but you need good card draw to really take advantage of it the way you think you're going to take advantage of it, because the opening hand required to make this card just amazing is going to be filled with lands, and that's not always the best thing either. So you're either going to miss some land drops with Exploration and just have it sit on the field, do nothing, or it's going to put in a lot of work and you have little to no cards in your hand because the majority of your hand was lands. So it's one of those weird cards where you either love it or hate it, but it definitely shouldn't be that expensive. I think $16 for the Conspiracy version is still way too expensive, and it needs to be reprinted in a commander deck preferably. They could just easily toss it into Masters 25, but I think that would be a little bit bad for draft. I don't think it would be interesting. This isn't necessarily the card that you look for in limited anyway, but I still think it's a good card for commander, and a lot of decks can take advantage of it if built correctly. So anyway, guys, that's going to do it for these 10 reasonable reprints for Commander in the year 2018. So anytime this year they want to decide to reprint these cards, I think it's definitely necessary. Either just providing a good foundation for the format, lowering the price of a lot of these cards is going to be healthier. But as always, you guys have a wonderful day. Void here signing off. See you all next video.